Well, we have a heavy and very serious subject to discuss here today, so I'm going to make the introductions very brief, and we'll get right on with it. Most of you have met virtually everyone on the stage today, but let me begin with Ari Shavit. Ari Shavit is a very prominent Israeli journalist, columnist, and the author of the New York Times bestseller, My Promised Land, The Triumph and Tragedy of Israel. Next to Ari, we have Bret Stephens. Bret Stephens is one of the most widely read columnists in the United States today. Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the Wall Street Journal, their foreign affairs editor. And author of America in Retreat, The New Isolationism, and the Coming Global Disorder. And we've all met Andrew Roberts, who keynoted our festival earlier. Andrew is an award-winning historian, author of 12 books, and I commend to everyone his very timely and riveting essay, The Modern Swastika, which is available on Kindle, and it's probably an hour read, and it's an extremely worthwhile hour that I would commend to everyone. So let's get on with it. I'll begin and I'll pose this question to all of our panelists, a rather simple question with an extraordinarily complicated answer. What in the world is going on in Europe? The conflict between Israel and the Palestinians seems too easy an answer to talk about what is happening in Europe today. Anti-Israel feeling, to whatever extent it exists, may be a trigger, but historically outbreaks, serious outbreaks of anti-Semitism have always had one trigger or another. Very recently, the Anti-Defamation League completed a study of consisting of 330,000 interviews, found that, very briefly, that 25% of the people in the EU hold anti-Semitic attitudes. The number was 37% in France. So anti-Semitism is obviously alive and well just a few decades after the Holocaust. So what is our takeaway from all of this? Ari, can I begin with you?
Yes, first of all, thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure. It's been a long journey to come, but I'm so happy I made it, and with my remarkable colleagues here, and it's such an important subject. So, first of all, I'm happy we begin with anti-Semitism, because I think the terrorist issue is a different issue, and they have some relationship, but each one should be discussed as it is. So let's begin with anti-Semitism. First of all, I'd like us to warn ourselves from the two dangers. One is to ignore or to overlook anti-Semitism, and the other is to be totally obsessed with it and to see that everything is because people, specifically in this case Europeans, hate Jews. We have to be aware of the malaise of the problem, but to try to see it as it is. Basically, I think that what has happened, first of all, Europe is politically ill. Europe doesn't work. By the way, it's not the only political entity that is ill. We live in a troubling time, and we have troubling phenomena in many countries. But Europe has specifically, it's a continent that doesn't produce babies, that doesn't defend itself, and parts of it don't work, literally don't work, is in trouble. So that's the first issue. Regarding the Jews, let's put the context. First of all, it is important that the Europeans will understand they have a commitment regarding the Jewish people and the Jewish state. We, Jews, were Europe's ultimate other for 1,500 years. Then we became its ultimate victim. So there is a moral commitment on the European side to deal with this issue. It is unacceptable that so many Europeans see Israel as an evil entity. It is unacceptable that 5-year-old Jewish children in Brussels, the capital of Europe, need the defense of Belgian paratroopers to go to kindergarten. This cannot be. The fact that wearing a kippah in Paris is an issue, unacceptable. What has happened? One, following the Holocaust, we had a kind of amnesty. The Holocaust was, in a sense, a kind of terrible chemotherapy for the old cancer of hating the Jews. And 70 years later, this is the impact of the Holocaust is weaker. Then we have other issues that are not pure anti-Semitism. Israel and Europe rub each other the wrong way on several dimensions. Basically, I would say that the Jewish people and the Europeans came out of Auschwitz with contradictory decisions. We decided that never again we'll be powerless. The Europeans went into never again to have bloodshed, almost at any cost. So the fact that we are engaged because we rebuilt our nation and we live where we are engaged in wars, that's difficult for them. They took the opposite decision. There is deep appeasement in you. Then there is the issue of church and state. Europe has become so secular. It's a kind of secular church, actually. We, with our Jewish identity as a Jewish democratic state, we confuse them. So again, we rub them the wrong way because they are troubled by the certain religious elements in our life. 3, they decided to disengage from the third world. They ruled half the world, if not more. And they decided to end colonialism and to go back and to dismantle all their empires. We are perceived, I think it's a wrong notion, but we, by going back to our ancient homeland, found ourselves in a constant friction with the third world. So again, we rub them the wrong way. So because of all these issues, that helped in bringing out two different phenomena. One is the extreme, vicious anti-Semitism, mainly from minorities, not from the European majority. But what troubles me even more is this silent resentment and a kind of attitude that Israel and the Jews are unpleasant again. And that, even although it's more subtle, it troubles me even more than the extreme phenomena. And I think it's essential to have a dialogue with Europe, saying to the Europeans, on the one hand, not generalizing, not seeing them all as anti-Semitic, but bringing back the element of their moral responsibility. Because of the past, I always say to Europeans, they cannot afford the risk of having another Jewish catastrophe. They just cannot have the risk. And sadly, they're doing everything, many of them, not all of them, many of them do not share this sentiment whatsoever and are taking steps and attitudes that are morally wrong and are politically dangerous.
Bret, how about weighing in on this?
Well, again, I'm very honored to have you on either side and to have this opportunity here today. I think Ari spoke extremely well. I would just add a few points. There's an old joke that the definition of a British anti-Semite is someone who hates Jews more than is absolutely necessary. And present company accepted.
Thank you.
You know, we're now suddenly seeing this kind of eruption of rather overt anti-Semitism. But the truth is that for many, many years now, European anti-Semitism was just below that line. I mean, I remember vividly when I was working for the Wall Street Journal in Brussels, before I moved to Israel to edit the Jerusalem Post. The second Intifada had just started, and The Economist magazine, which is a distinguished magazine, ran what they call a leader, we would call one of their front of the book editorials, in which they were talking about the beginning of the Intifada, which, as we later learned, was a premeditated act by Yasser Arafat and his people. And they had a line in which said, Israelis are, it said something like, Israelis are a sophisticated people, their talents are above the ordinary, but they must curb their greed for other people's land. And I remember reading that and thinking, this is an exact formulation of old-fashioned anti-Semitism. Jews are clever, but greedy. We've just simply substituted the word Israelis for Jews and transposed the greed from money to land. And this was being written in probably the most prestigious magazine, certainly in Great Britain and maybe in all of Europe. So this has been going on for a long time. You can even go back to the 1970s and the accommodations the Europeans were busy making with the PLO way back then. Now suddenly we're starting to notice it. And we notice it because it seems to be bubbling up from below. What I mean is it's bubbling up from what, to speak frankly, but truthfully, is the Arab or Muslim or North African or Turkish cultures that now have been for generations in Germany, in France, and so on. And that produces its own, its distempers and its terrorism and so on. But the reality is that the real source of what I think is modern European anti-Semitism isn't a bottom-up phenomenon, it's a top-down phenomenon. And let me give you an example. In the summer of 2014, Hamas starts a war with Israel. It fires rockets indiscriminately at Israeli civilians who are living behind the old, what used to be called the Green Line in Israel, quote, proper, pre-1967 Israel. It digs tunnels in order to snatch Israeli civilians living in the kibbutzim along the borders with Gaza. What the Palestinians are doing is by any definition a war crime. Israel offers one ceasefire after another, each of which is rejected until the very last by Hamas. What happens 6 months after this war of atrocity by the Palestinians against Israel? European parliaments begin to recognize a Palestinian state, including the French parliament just weeks before the attack on Charlie Hebdo and the attack on the kosher hypermarché the following day. Well, that sets a tone, that sets a signal, that sets the view that at the upper tier of European intelligentsia and society, it is okay to delegitimize Israel or to work in tandem with its enemies only months after it has been so grossly and brutishly attacked. So when the baseline is, okay, Israel is this at best dubious, if not outright nefarious agent of harm in the Middle East, let's not be surprised that the lower orders of human intelligence simply refuse to make the fine-grained distinction between who's an Israeli and who's a Jew. And this is what has happened. This is what really worries me about Europe. Where I would differ a little bit with Ari is I don't think we run a risk of exaggerating the danger this poses. The danger it poses, of course, to European Jews, who I think need to think very seriously about their future on that continent. And I think this also goes, although Andrew will speak to this, I'm sure, of British Jews, but also about the future of Europe itself. We have learned in history that when continents or countries or civilizations begin to attack or delegitimize their Jews, it is the beginning or evidence, a symptom of the deeper disease and of their decline. You can trace the decline of the Spanish Empire to 1492 and the eviction of the Jews from Spain. And I think you similarly can do that with Europe today. It is obviously telling that Israel today has more of a startup economy with 6 or 7 million people than all of Europe with 500 million people. And maybe, there are deeper reasons to that. But it is not going to end until two things or a few things happen. Number one, that a fundamentally new understanding among Europeans of the necessity of the state and of the security of Israel for their own defense becomes broadly based, because as Israel goes, so certainly goes Europe. And if the Europeans can't adopt the kind of muscular civilizational confidence that Israelis have in the face of the barbarism that they mutually confront, Europe is going to be lost. But more than that, I mean, if anti-Semitism is obviously a complex phenomenon, but part of anti-Semitism surely is the universal feeling, the universal emotion of envy towards success. And you've constructed a European social democratic model whose fundamental animating economic and political impulse is envy. Why do you have something and I don't? That's, by the way, a fundamental distinction between Europe and, at least until recently, the United States. So if Europe cannot sort of broach these things, if they can't start to deal with them in some serious way, the continent is on its road to a very bad place. Analogies are often made to the 1930s. They're not inapt.
Thank you. You know, the first historical genocide that we read about dates all the way back to the book of Esther, 300 years before the Common Era. And variations of these insults or offenses have recurred with really startling regularity over time. Over a period of 1,700 years, there have been 80 mass expulsions from either nations or provinces or cities. That's one every 21 years on average. So, Andrew, you are our historian. You are a non-Jew. How about weighing in on this?
Well, I'm also a founder member of the Friends of Israel initiative, and it was as thank you, that's very kind of you. And it was whilst I was getting ready for a conference about 5 years ago on that I saw the latest pogrom. It can only be called a pogrom that had been taking place in Malmö in Sweden, where some 80 Jewish families were basically burnt out of that city. In the last year, attacks on Jews, called incidents, anti-Semitic incidents, which are the police are only just now treating as separate from any other kind of incident, even though they're very obviously anti-Semitic, have increased in the United Kingdom by 30%. This includes everything from physical attacks on Jews to to racial screaming and shouting at people in the street, to actual desecration of synagogues and of Jewish burial sites. 30%. And those are official figures. The Community Security Trust, which is a fantastic body of young Jews who collate all the figures and they patrol the streets in Jewish areas under threat, they say that it could actually be higher than that. And what one finds again and again in Europe, exactly as Ari was saying, it is a cancer, but it's a cancer that is constantly metasizing. And as Bret said, it comes from the top at the level of the European Union, which has just recently said that it's going to specially label all Jewish goods from the 1949 armistice line, from beyond the 1949 armistice line, which is clearly, as the Lithuanian foreign minister said 2 years ago, the beginning of an attempt to impose an EU boycott on Jewish trade. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is something that just must not be allowed to stand. Thank you. And you see in places like Holland and in Scandinavia, in particular, which had politicians, mainstream politicians from both of those countries, after the attacks on Paris, said that it was a result of the Israeli-Palestinian issue and basically tried to blame the Jews for it. This is the most astonishing thing. In Holland, last November, they invited the member of the Knesset, Hanan Zoubi, to speak to the a woman who has never had a good word to say about Israel. They invited her, of all people, to speak at the Kristallnacht commemoration. And what did she do? She equated Israel with Nazi Germany. At the Kristallnacht commemoration, ladies and gentlemen, these things are absolutely horrific, they are ongoing, and they are growing. And if pressure is not put on the European Union, which it hardly can be by Israel, because Israel is, for all that it's growing fast, it's a much smaller economy, obviously, than the 500 million people in Europe, then we are going to get to the point where Israel is going to be boycotted. And that, as I mentioned, will be utterly disastrous.
So a question for all three of our panelists. Anti-Semitism has been referred to many times as the oldest hatred. We can look at history and say it has indeed had an infinite past. Do we think anti-Semitism has an infinite future?
Shall I?
Please.
First of all, I'm afraid so, but let me refer a bit and try to connect the dots here. First of all, I must, and I'll refer to what Bret hinted. I said how troubled I am with what's going on in Europe and what terrible disease it is. But being a free-thinking, and I would say a Jew, I find difficulty in overgeneralizing, and I think we have to be careful. We have to look where evil is. We have to fight in a very effective way. But sometimes there is a tendency to go into the victimhood situation and to just see, the Gentiles are hating us, and that's it. It's a bit more complicated. It's a bit more complicated. So let me go briefly through the history. With all the anti-Semitism deep in Europe, without Europe, we would not have had Israel. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in London in 1917. But the Zionist movement and the Jews were smart and sophisticated, and we got the Balfour Declaration, without which we would not have had Israel. America was very nice to us. It did not give us a homeland. Europe did. Then, in the 1950s, after the Holocaust, it was France. It was a different France, but it was France that gave us the ability to have a modern air force, an army, and a nuclear reactor. America did not stand by us. Then it turned. So we have to look at the complexity. What went wrong? It turned because when the real deep, amazing alliance with America was forged, first by Levi Eshkol and Lyndon Johnson, and then by Golda Meir and Richard Nixon. And we have to remember that with all the respect to the presidents before, it was Johnson and Nixon who forged the real alliance with Israel. So then America stood by us, and Europe betrayed us in the most vicious way, even before present-day anti-Semitism. In 1967, France betrays us when we really have existential danger. And in 1973, when American planes are coming to save us, when we are in danger, no European democracy lets them land.
Portugal.
I said only Portugal.
Yeah.
I said no democracy. Only Portugal that is under a CIA influence. So let's look at the company, because if we'll just get into a state of mind that we are hated, they all hate us, we can do nothing about it, it's not good advice. And if you look at present-day Europe, there are such troubling phenomena throughout Europe that were described, and there is much more. And because I lecture in universities, I saw some of these problems eye to eye. By the way, I saw some problems in UC universities as well, including Swastikas. But it's worse in Europe, much worse. America is so much better than Europe. America, I think you can be so proud of America. In so many ways, I'm like one of the most pro-Americans on this planet. And I think that with all the mistakes America sometimes makes, America gave the world its best 70 years with more peace and less war, more freedom and less tyranny, more prosperity and less poverty in the last 70 years. America is amazing, and the way that America treats Jews, what Jews have achieved here, I think it's a great achievement for the Jews, and it's a pride for America. And you don't have it in Europe. But looking at Europe, you have the nasty phenomena, but then you have people like Angela Merkel, who stands by, she has a real moral commitment to Israel. I don't know if you're aware, but the 6 submarines that we are getting from Germany for a third of the price are pretty special submarines with special capabilities. The Pentagon cannot give us these submarines. There is no way. And Angela Merkel is giving us these submarines. So we have to be smart, to look at the eye at the danger, at the hate, at the malaise, at the cancer, but not to generalize, to look for those decent Europeans, to look for the potential allies, not to get into a kind of ghetto mentality that we can do nothing and they all hate us and it's gone. The whole point about the Zionist movement was to be active, to take our destiny in our own hands, and to look for allies. Just the other day, Lord Weidenfeld died a few days ago, who was such an amazing British Jew from Austrian origin. And he was so clever in dealing with all the complexities of Europe and looking for the most surprising allies. We should have the Weidenfeld and Chaim Weizmann approach and not become overphobic. Now getting to your question. The element, and this connects deeply to America. In my reading of anti-Semitism is that the pattern is the following. Sadly, there is a deep hate for the Jews for 2 or 3 reasons. One, because of the painful religious history with several other religions, and the story with Christianity became so much better. It's like, again, a hopeful story. The story with large parts of Islam is getting worse. But there was this element. Then there was the fact that we were the ultimate other. And then there was this, what you refer to, the envy, the problem of the success. A successful minority brings a lot of hate. So there was basic hate throughout the ages. What did the Jews do to defend themselves? They created alliances with the kings, with power. Because smart kings and queens throughout history realized that having a Jewish minority brings prosperity. So the Jews had the support of the king, while the larger public did not like them. Then what happened, that when you had revolutions, the hate for the Jews erupted, and it was like double hate. One, the old hate, and then because the Jews were perceived as the agent of the kings. So that the dangerous outbreaks of anti-Semitism come with the collapse of order and revolution periods. And I am afraid that what we see today with the return of anti-Semitism, relating to what was said here, is that the king is now America. And Israel is associated in the old way that the Jews used to be associated with the king. The state of Israel has exactly the role that's called intimate relationship with the world's king. And a lot of the apprehension, a lot of the tension, the hostility towards America goes to the Jews. So this is what's so troubling about this phenomenon. And this makes even the connection, the alliance between the Jews and America even deeper. But I think that we have to understand that this is part of a world that is growing chaotic with more and more discontent, is a world that is specifically more dangerous for the Jews.
Well, I agree with 80% of what Ari said, so I'm going to focus on the 20%. When I was editor of the Jerusalem Post, I had an occasion to interview a very well-bred European diplomat who was then the EU's representative to Israel. And I was having a conversation with him, and I remember I said, this was in 2002 when the Syrian army still occupied Lebanon, as it had for, I think at that point, 25 years or so. And I said, you guys never speak of the brutal Syrian occupation of Lebanon. You never talk about it. But you go on and on and on and on and on about the vastly less brutal Israeli so-called occupation of the West Bank. Why is that? He said, well, you have to understand, we Europeans, we see you Israelis as one of us. So we're not going to judge you the way we would judge the Arabs or the Colombians or who, you know, God knows what. And I was reminded, listening to him, of that wonderful line from Eric Hoffer, the great philosopher, American philosopher, that Israel is the only country in the world expected to behave like a Christian nation. Now, Eric Hoffer wrote that actually in 1968, just after the Six-Day War, and he was reflecting the fact that is now forgotten today, that the hatred of Israel actually predates the '67 war. It didn't all begin with the so-called occupation after that particular war. But this goes to the question that you asked. I mean, the Jews were murdered in Europe in the millions because they were not one of us, and now they are demonized in Europe because they're, quote, one of us, and so they're expected to behave in a different fashion from the way in which they act. Now, one place where I disagree with Ari is, you know, you'll hear from someone even like Angela Merkel, who is, you know, certainly nothing like an anti-Semite, a philo-Semite, a friend of Israel, but Angela Merkel will still give in to this rhetoric that says, well, we have to recognize that there is legitimate criticism of Israel to be made. She says this over and over again. It's the knee jerks to say, I'm not an anti-Semite, but there is legitimate. Now, this is the kind of criticism, all right, that she would never dare to mount with Xi Jinping, okay, should she meet with him and say, I want to talk about the occupation of Tibet, which has been ongoing since 1951 or whenever, 59, okay? She's never going to talk with the Prime Minister Modi of India and say, I'd like to talk about the occupation of Kashmir, which we strongly object to. There's never a discussion with the Moroccans to discuss the fact that Western Sahara has been under Moroccan occupation, and there's no effort to label Moroccan products from Western Sahara, if such exist. I don't know what they make in Western Sahara. Differently from products made in Morocco or put them under an invidious, some kind of invidious trade restrictions. This only happens with the Israelis, okay? And this has to be fought, and it has to be fought very clearly. Someone ought to say, Ms. Merkel, I understand you Europeans have a problem with the occupation. I'd like to know, is the Western Wall occupied territory in your definition? Because the Western Wall of Jerusalem, ladies and gentlemen, is across the 1967 borders. Is that occupied? All right, let's actually talk about what this occupation business means. And by the way, what assurances are you Europeans going to give us after we would retreat from the West Bank? Because what we noticed when we got out of the Gaza Strip entirely, all settlements, all settlers, is that Europe didn't come rushing to our aid when we were then subsequently attacked on 3 separate occasions in 2008, 2012, and then 2014. On the contrary, Europe began endorsing reports claiming that Israel was committing war crimes. So this has to be confronted in a much more, if I may say, aggressive way. You know, and one final point. Jews in America ought to take as their role models what African Americans did here in the United States. Let me tell you what I mean by that. After the end of Jim Crow, after the end of legal discrimination in this country, Black Americans said, we are not going to, never mind discrimination in the legal field, we're not going to accept racism as a cultural phenomenon. We are going to shame you. If you tell a racist joke as a comedian in America, you're going to be evicted, right, from society. Doesn't mean you're going to be put in jail, but it means you're never going to get on this show again. You're never going to get an invitation from, I don't know, Seth Meyers or whoever, Jimmy Fallon, to go on your show. You will, because we are going to erect a taboo. And so Black Americans have been raising the taboo against racist behavior. Taboos are the dividing line between civilization and barbarism. And here's where I disagree with Ari. When we start to parse every statement as Jews, when we say, okay, well, that is not exactly anti-Semitism, that is just ferocious criticism of Israel that is never mounted against any other country, then we end up in a process of arguing with ourselves about what is and is not exactly above or below the line, and we end up, to adopt Daniel Moynihan's line, defining deviancy down. So that now you can have reputable publishers like Farrar, Straus Giroux publishing what I think are thinly veiled anti-Semitic books like the Israel Lobby, claiming that a nefarious cabal of pro-Israel advocates are distorting American foreign policy to their own purposes and not in America's interest. And this is seen not as outrageous, it's seen as controversial, right? And who are we in the land of free speech to have a problem with controversy? So we have to, in a way, we have to be a little bit angrier sometimes than the precise facts themselves would warrant. Because unless those Europeans are put on notice, unless there is a sense of shame attached to their attacks on Israel, those attacks will continue to mount in their frequency and their viciousness.
And as an aside, the word lobby was always capitalized.
Is it? Yeah. What I'd like to add to that, and actually it's interesting you should mention the Western Wall, because only last, can you hear me now at the back there? Only last year, just picking up what Bret was saying about the Western Wall, only last year the British Advertising Standards Authority said that an advert that was taken out by the Israeli Tourism Board was illegal, had to be taken down because it showed the Western Wall. And that was supposedly misleading, and therefore all the posters had to be removed from the subway and so on. It's a little sign of the kind of ways that the bureaucracy works. But I am not wholly depressed at all. It might sound pretty harsh from up here, but actually there are lots of things that ordinary people can and should do. A classic example, NGOs. The European Union pays NGOs, dozens and dozens of them, gives them straightforward wads of cash, and those NGOs, the ones that are based in Israel, then write anti-Israel reports. It happens again and again. The EU then uses those reports that they have themselves effectively commissioned in order to make problems for Israel. Well, pressure should be brought on these NGOs. The NGOs get money from you as much as from anybody else. And pressure should be brought on them not to be constantly taking anti-Israeli stances. Another great example is the New York Times. The New York Times recently... Come on, you all know this, don't you, ladies and gentlemen? The New York Times recently, there was last May, there was a series of 3 stabbing attacks in Israel. One Israeli was killed. Luckily, all 3 of the Palestinians and others were wounded. And we're talking women and children here, of course, as ever. And all 3 of the Palestinian knife attackers were killed. Headline in the New York Times: 1 Israeli, 3 Palestinians killed on the West Bank. That was the headline. So often, again and again, the media, the newspapers, present news in such a way that it has to be deliberately misleading, because otherwise these people would be morons. And so I think it's very important that pressure is brought by the readers, just as it should be brought by the people who are financing the NGOs. We are not powerless in the face of this constant denigration and delegitimization of Israel.
We have a few minutes for questions. Second row here.
Can you tell us what an NGO is?
Oh, sorry, an NGO is a non-governmental organization. It's War on Want, it's Christian Aid, it's all of these, lots of them are very important and perfectly reasonable charities who across the whole of the rest of the world do wonderful work, and then in Israel take again and again a institutionally anti-Israeli stance.
Helene?
Yes, I'd like to know if you have any comment on the action on a million
Bret?
The question is, what is my take on the mass migration of Muslims from Afghanistan to North Africa into Europe? And my answer is that if it continues unchecked, it's a civilizational catastrophe for Europe. Now, I've made a proposal in a column, which is that in the name of charity, Europe should have no problem bringing in desperate mothers and girls and women from Middle Eastern countries, certainly not in unlimited numbers, but in great numbers. Right now, one of the great problems is something like 2/3 to 3/4 of the migrants are young men between the ages of 20 and 30. But Europe simply cannot become, and I say this as someone who's very much sort of in theory in favor of immigration, Europe simply cannot absorb that number of people that quickly, especially when the cultural chasm, as we saw in the horrendous situation you had in Cologne and elsewhere, when that chasm is so very, very deep. And look, I wrote a column. I'm a nice Jewish boy. My great-grandfather was a rabbi from Lithuania. I wrote a column a few months ago called In Defense of Christendom. What is Europe in the end? Europe is Christendom, okay? It is Christendom. Now, it's Christendom with democracy and human rights and open economies and all this lovely stuff, right? But it's Christendom. Europe is Rome, not Carthage. It is Athens, not Persia, okay? And it is Christianity, not the Caliphate. And if you can't make fundamental distinctions like that, your civilization is not going to survive for very long. The very thing which is propelling the Europeans to be so inviting to these desperate refugees is what used to be called Christian charity. And this is ultimately the real problem that Europe has. Europe it has economic problems, it has political problems, and so on. Europe has an intellectual problem. It doesn't know what it is, all right? If you talk to Europeans, what is the EU about? They'll use words like we're a union of tolerance, and tolerance is great, and pluralism is wonderful, et cetera, and human rights. All that's very good. But you have to understand where those things come from. And ultimately, they come from a unique civilization, which is the marriage of Jerusalem and Athens, the marriage of reason and revelation, which gives you a culture of technological mastery tempered by human decency. That is what this civilization ought to be about, and it needs to quickly develop the intellectual and moral resources to be able to stand up for itself. Because if it doesn't, you're going to see a situation very much like what you had in the 5th and 4th century AD, or CE, I should say. AD, all right. In which, how did Rome fall? It wasn't conquest, it was immigration. So Europe should be mindful of these precedents, not least so that it can sustain the humanitarian impulses which are now leading it into its current excess.
I think. I'd like to add that I think that Mrs. Merkel must have been clinically insane to have invited 1 million Syrians into Germany, not just for the reasons that Bret has given, but also because, of course, it was going to act like a magnet to the other 14 million Syrians that have been displaced by this monstrous civil war. If you're looking for the people who are ultimately responsible for that horrific, heart-rending photograph of that little boy who was face down in the waves, yes, of course, to an extent, it's the Assad regime, of course. Yes, it's also the human traffickers, but it's also got to be the governments that said, come over and your dad will find a job, come over and you'll find a living. It's monstrous.
Final word, Ari.
Yeah, so first of all, referring to the question, we have to understand that we have a refugee problem because the West made terrible, terrible mistakes over the last 15 years with dealing with the Middle East. And it's not only Europeans and not only naive liberals who made those mistakes. Everybody made mistakes regarding the Middle East. Let's get out of the partisan approach It's very dangerous for world order, very dangerous for American strategy, very dangerous for Israel. And I must say, and you disagree with me, I'll tell you where I disagree with you. I'm out there in the front. My last year has been dedicated to speaking to young Americans. I don't see many young Americans here. I speak to young Americans who are half Europeans in their attitude. I speak to Europeans, the decent, reasonable Europeans. If we will associate Israel and the Jewish cause just with one party in America, just with one way of thinking, we will alienate the vast majority. The way to win, the way to defend Israel is to win the center. It like applies, I'll take the metaphor for your own politics. If you do not understand, if you don't win the center, you lose it. The great wisdom of Israeli policy, pro-Israeli approach, the Zionist movement, was to keep Israel a bipartisan issue, inviting people of all convictions to support it. If we will speak in terms that drive away the millennials, that will endanger Israel more than anything else. I go around campuses where it's difficult, where they will not take my prime minister or my ambassador. I fight for the Israeli Air Force of 2040. Because if we'll just use old-fashioned terms, we will lose the battle. So I ask you all here, now it's easy for the people who are in the center and center-left. I ask people on the intelligent, committed right to understand where the battle is. We need a renewed narrative. We have to be angry, aggressive, very proud, but intelligent and use 21st century terms. If we will not do that, we will endanger Israel in a horrible way. Thank you.
So what did you think of our panel?